The scapegoat son grew up understanding something that no child should ever have to learn. Peace always comes at a cost. And in his family, that cost was always him. Whenever something went wrong, whenever tensions flared, whenever blame needed to be placed somewhere, the answer was always the same. The fingers pointed at him. The accusations fell on his shoulders. The anger of the household, the frustration, the disappointment, it was all funneled into him, whether or not he had anything to do with it. At first, he fought it. He cried. He defended himself. He tried to explain. But in a family that had already decided his role, explanations were pointless. His words fell on deaf ears, his innocence ignored. It was easier for them to turn him into the problem than to confront the real issues brewing beneath the surface. So, he learned. He learned that protesting only made things worse, that the more he resisted, the harder the punishment became, that pushing back meant inviting more chaos, more shouting, more disappointment. And so, he stopped resisting. He became the family's emotional punching bag, the one who absorbed everyone else's frustrations so they wouldn't have to face themselves. He learned to take the fall, to accept the blame, because somehow, carrying it himself felt safer than watching the family implode. If pretending to be the problem kept the household from collapsing, wasn't that better? That's what he told himself. But guilt is a heavy thing to carry when it isn't yours to bear. Guilt isn't just a fleeting feeling. It sinks deep, latching onto the soul like a parasite, whispering lies over and over until they start to feel like the truth. And so, as he grew older, he didn't just carry guilt, he became it. It followed him in everything he did. It was there when he made a mistake, telling him that he was a failure. It was there when he succeeded, reminding him that he didn't deserve it. It was there when he sat in silence, filling the quiet with memories of every time he had been blamed for something that was never his fault. And so, he worked harder. Not because he wanted to, not because he loved the grind, but because proving his worth felt like the only way to silence the echoes of the past. He carried more responsibility than anyone else. He took on extra burdens. He gave more than he had. Because deep down, there was a voice in his head telling him that if he could just be good enough, if he could just do more, then maybe, just maybe, he would finally be seen as something other than the problem. But no matter how hard he tried, the feeling never left. Because the truth is, no amount of hard work can erase a lie that was never yours to believe in the first place. Now as an adult, he carries that weight in silence. He is angry, but he doesn't let it show. He is hardened, but he refuses to break. He moves through life like a machine, always working, always doing, always proving, because stopping means thinking, and thinking means remembering. And remembering means facing all the things he buried long ago. He never asks for what he needs because no one ever asked him what he wanted. His entire life has been built around making other people comfortable, around making sure that they didn't have to face their demons, around shrinking himself down to fit into the box they put him in. But deep down, there's a question he has never dared to ask, a question that lingers in the back of his mind, whispering in moments of silence, in the quiet between responsibilities, in the rare moments where he lets himself breathe. When does he get to be understood? When does he get to be more than a scapegoat? When does he get to be more than a burden? When does he get to be seen for who he truly is? But here's the truth. He was never the problem. Not as a child, not as a teenager, not as an adult. The people who blamed him weren't looking for truth. They weren't looking for fairness. They were looking for an escape, a way to avoid looking in the mirror, a way to push their own pain, their own failures, their own shortcomings onto someone else. And he was the easiest target. They placed their burdens on his shoulders, not because he deserved it, but because it was easier than holding themselves accountable. But that doesn't mean he has to carry it anymore. He doesn't have to hold on to the guilt that was never his. He doesn't have to live under the weight of blame that was never meant for him. He doesn't have to keep proving himself to people who will never truly see him. Because his worth was never theirs to define, he is allowed to let go. Let go of the guilt. Let go of the shame. Let go of the belief that he has to earn love, that he has to prove he is worthy, because he already is. He is allowed to step out of the shadows of other people's mistakes and finally see himself clearly. He was never weak for enduring. He was never broken for surviving. He was never worthless just because someone else said he was. He is strong, not because he carried the weight of his family's dysfunction, but because he chose to survive it. And now he gets to decide what comes next. He gets to walk away from the past. He gets to rewrite his story. He gets to choose a life where he is not just someone else's scapegoat, but his own person. Because his life is no longer about proving them wrong. It's about proving himself right. It's about choosing himself. It's about being free. And for the first time in his life, he finally understands something he was never told as a child. Peace was never his responsibility to keep. Healing is a strange thing. For years, the scapegoat son thought healing meant proving them wrong, that if he could just achieve more, become more, be more, then maybe he could erase the past. Maybe the people who blamed him would look at him differently. Maybe they would finally say, "We were wrong about you." But healing doesn't come from external validation. And deep down, he knew. They were never going to say those words, because to admit they were wrong would mean confronting the truth, and the truth was inconvenient for them. It required self-reflection, accountability, and change, things they had never been willing to face. So he had to make a decision. Would he keep chasing an apology that would never come? Would he keep trying to prove his worth to people who refused to see it? Would he keep living his life in reaction to his past instead of building something for himself? For the first time, he realized something painful, yet liberating. Healing isn't about getting closure from others. It's about giving it to yourself. And so, he started the long, difficult process of unlearning everything he had been taught to believe about himself. Unlearning is harder than learning, because when a lie is told to you often enough, it starts to feel like truth. So, he had to untangle the falsehoods that had shaped him. He had been told that he was difficult, but he was never difficult. He was misunderstood. He had been told that he was selfish, but he was never selfish. He was just tired of being neglected. He had been told that he was the problem, but he was never the problem. He was just an easy target. And the hardest thing of all? Unlearning the belief that he had to earn love. Because love, real love, isn't something you should have to prove yourself worthy of. It's something given freely, without conditions, without expectations, without tests. And if someone only loves you when you're pleasing them, when you're quiet, when you're bending to their will, then that isn't love. That's control. And he was done being controlled. For the first time in his life, he asked himself, what do I want? Not what keeps the peace, not what makes other people happy, not what prevents conflict. What do I truly want? At first, he didn't know how to answer, because no one had ever asked him that before. He had spent his whole life accommodating others, making sure they were comfortable, making sure he didn't step out of line. And now, faced with the freedom to choose himself, he realized he had never been given the tools to do so. So, he started small. He started by setting boundaries, something he had never been allowed to do. He stopped answering calls that drained his energy. He stopped saying yes when he really wanted to say no. He stopped explaining himself to people who had already made up their minds about him. And at first, the guilt was unbearable. Because when you've been trained to keep the peace at your own expense, standing up for yourself feels wrong. It feels like rebellion. It feels selfish, but it wasn't. It was survival. And the more he did it, the more he realized something shocking. The world didn't fall apart when he chose himself. The sky didn't collapse when he prioritized his needs. The people who truly cared about him didn't leave. Only the ones who benefited from his silence did. and that was their loss. There was a time when he thought he needed closure to move on, that he needed an apology, that he needed acknowledgement, that he needed them to finally see him for who he was. But closure isn't something you get from others. It's something you create for yourself. So he made a choice. He let go, not for them, but for himself. Let go of the need to be understood. Let go of the fantasy that one day they would change. Let go of the weight of trying to fix something that was never his to fix. Because he finally realized something life-changing. His peace was worth more than their approval. And for the first time, he felt light. Not because they had changed, not because they had finally apologized, not because everything had been made right, but because he no longer needed them to. He was free.